Derelict Paradise, Homelessness and Urban Development in Cleveland, Ohio, where he seeks answers to the question, who benefits from homelessness? The book examines Cleveland's history from the late 19th century through the early 21st. Kerr is currently working on a manuscript addressing the research he conducted with the Cleveland Homelessness Oral History Project, where he interviewed close to 200 homeless people and facilitated dozens of workshops and meetings in shelters and drop-in centers of Cleveland. He addresses this work in detail in the article, We Know What the Problem Is, in the Oral History Review, published in the Winter-Spring edition of 2003. And tonight we're going to talk about how oral history can facilitate movement building. Focusing on his work with the Cleveland Homeless Oral History Project, Daniel Kerr will examine how oral history research can move beyond professional and academic aims and actively facilitate social change. Rather than pursue one more study of extreme poverty from afar, he embraced oral history as a technique to foster structured dialogue among unhoused people so that they could come to a greater understanding of their own condition. They did so not only by giving their own interviews, but by listening to and interpreting the narrative of other project participants. Collective reflection became inseparable from collective action as CHOHP participants utilized the power of their stories as a tool to transform the world around them.
Thank you. Actually, it's CHOP. I like acronyms no, it is CHOHP, but I choose acronyms that are like I used to be involved in a group called the Squatter Theater Action Brigade, and the acronym was STAB. And so CHOP was, I kind of like calling it CHOP. Can I just get a quick sense? I know many of you have at least read one of my articles within the class for today, but how many folks are familiar with or have read any of my work? That way I know how much background I need to do versus not. If you're not familiar, haven't read my work, would you mind raising your hand? Okay, great. Okay, I'll just assume that you don't, I won't assume you know, that way it'll be better. So, all right, this is a project, really, what I'd like to do is take a couple steps back before I get into how oral history can facilitate movement building, which I do want to have a discussion in terms of today and in the future. Now hopefully we can open that up also to dialogue moving forward. But obviously, in order to do this presentation, I also have to talk about my past experience with oral history. So I'm going to focus a good hunk of this presentation on the Cleveland Homeless Oral History Project and the work that was done there, and just some of the evolution that was done there, and the practice that I embraced through that project. I came to that project actually first working as an activist, primarily interested in issues of housing. My passion was in addressing issues of housing, and I was fascinated by the squatters movement, and ultimately participated in it in the Lower East Side for 3 years. Where the goal was really to take over abandoned buildings and create housing. It's a very direct approach to dealing with this, and we literally built barricades. It's from 13th Street evictions, 1995, May 1995. We literally built barricades and to try and protect the buildings. One of the things I learned, however, is that in order to get to a point where you actually build a barricade on the street and face down thousands of riot police, there's a lot of storytelling that goes on before that. People don't just go out on the street and build a barricade without telling a lot of stories. And so really the side of the squatters movement that influenced me in terms of understanding movements was all those downtimes hanging out on park benches and on stoops where people told the history, both the history and their stories, frequently not their life stories, as I'll get into shortly, but various stories about neighborhood transformation, their analysis, their historical analysis as to how things were and why they were the way they were, as well as their prescriptions for change that were debated in those particular spaces, really intrigued me. There was no research. I didn't perceive myself as a researcher, and I wasn't interested in documentation or being a documentarian. I was really envisioning myself as a participant. Okay, and so it was a pretty significant change moving from the Lower East Side to Cleveland, Ohio, for many reasons. And it was a deliberate, intentional move. One was I was really seeking to get away from kind of a place where people go to be cool and activists and hip. And people don't really, well, there's actually some exceptions to this rule, don't go to the homeless shelters of Cleveland to be hip. And so it just seemed to me one of the more unhip places I could think about. And that's in part what motivated me to try and explore a place where I could work with folks who were not necessarily, well, okay, no, I'm just going to leave that out. So the second thing, and I should say, right shortly before I left the Lower East Side, I had multiple students, both undergrad and grad students, come and interview me. And so I figured I was really deliberately trying to escape academia to a large extent through participation in the squatters movement. And I figured I had really done it when I become the subject of research, in particular when an anthropology student was interviewing me. But I decided that there was in particular relevance to research if it was done as in the model of popular education. And I realized that there was quite a bit of research that was going into the activism that was taking place in the Lower East Side, and that there were a lot of folks that were not squatters that were really at the backbone of the squatters movement. And so I didn't have to be homeless in Cleveland, live in the shelter in order to play a role in actually addressing the conditions folks were in and developing solidarity with folks who were living in the shelter. That's what I was interested in, but I was going to, instead of taking an activist approach, embrace the idea of popular educators such as Paulo Freire, Miles Horton, who really argue that we need to let people define what the issues are themselves. That, as you probably, or maybe you can't see, as Miles Horton says, it's very important that you understand the difference between your perception of what people's problems are and their perception of them, right? So rather than going to Cleveland and saying, okay, we're going to take over abandoned buildings because this is what I understood as a relevant solution from coming as a squatter to Cleveland, I very deliberately wanted to see how folks perceive their own problems and lives from this situation, their own standpoint. The idea of praxis was one that I was particularly intrigued by because I thought there was a lot of action and activism going on in the squatters movement that did not incorporate a lot of critical reflection. And so the very idea of praxis, which is really movement where reflection and movement are inextricably intertwined, was one that I found extraordinarily compelling. How do we create spaces where people can reflect and move through the very process of reflection, right? And so It's not one after the other. It's literally, as Paulo Freire argues, simultaneous. And so I also was very interested in Paulo Freire's idea of generative themes, which is similar to, I think, what Miles Horton is getting at in his quote above that, and the idea of generative themes being letting folks, again, generate the themes that are shaping their lives and are relevant for their lives, play a role in that process, right? Rather than me defining those themes for them. And so those were pretty core to shaping my interest in setting up the Cleveland Homeless Oral History Project. It started off really with a program, Food Not Bombs, that I initiated in Cleveland. I had been involved in a free food program in Lower East Side, where we would gather and prepare food and share it in a park. And so when I moved to Cleveland, I was interested in the potential for food to bring people together. In particular, not as a form of charity. This was the food was shared really as a picnic style, help yourself picnic style, where people would come. We were not originally planning to set up on Public Square in downtown Cleveland. We went around and tried a bunch of different places, but we settled in on Public Square because at the time we were bringing the food down, which was on a Sunday afternoon. Public Square happened to be right in the middle of the public library in Tower City, which is where basically people who are unhoused move from the library as it closes down at 5 p.m. And walk across Public Square to this mall in particular when there's bad weather. It's also a central point for all of the bus stations. A lot of the bus stops are on Central Square or Public Square. So the food was brought down, and this was originally brought down in January of 1996. Now, one thing I can say is that program is has been going on every week, every Sunday since January of 1996, and still going on, right? And has played a role with the occupation movement in Cleveland, the Food Not Bombs folks. So while I might not have shaped everything, I think that still does continue. And so folks started gathering around the food and creating spaces to kind of talk and reflect. People came from different walks of life. It was this kind of central meeting space, a public space. Different age groups that brought different degrees of knowledge and expertise about the changes within the city. This Ralph Williams Pack, who came to the city in 1940, I believe 1945, if I remember correctly, and has lived downtown basically his whole life, right? Others who came to the meal included Robert Jackson and Bob Mulchan, would become core participants within a lot of the movements that were a product of this oral history project. So basically from 96 until 1999, every week I'm going downtown and hanging out and eating with folks and talking to people in what I at least refer to as kind of a hanging out mode, okay? Sharing experiences, talking to them, telling my stories as well as listening to their stories, talking about just basic things such as the weather and the various sports events, but also talking about politics both near and afar. And that played, I think, a central role in shaping the evolution of the project, so that when I do eventually in 1999 bring down the video camera, I think at least understanding this process of developing those relationships is essential to understanding how this project unfolds. I did start off in that very first year doing 4 life histories. Okay, I was interested in the idea that oral history could, I could develop some techniques. I was interested in popular education, and I was thinking about, very specifically, about how oral history could play a role in popular education. And I really couldn't conceive of oral history as anything different than life history. Okay, and so I interviewed these 4 individuals, and each of them just told me devastating stories that really ended in with a just sense of despair. There was a clear sense of longing for death. There were necrophilic narratives. Folks sought to distinguish themselves from other homeless in order to talk about how they were different from those people. It was done, I thought, there were folks who at a certain point in time, one guy I interviewed just stopped and said, you know what? He was talking about his addiction to crack cocaine, and he said, know what? There's nothing in this for me. Let's just stop this interview right now, right? Because this was also a narrative they were familiar with, because when they went through the intake procedures at the shelter, when they tried to access social services, they had to tell a story about their life history and how create a narrative in terms of how they're trying to create personal, individual transformation, right? Which was frequently done through distinguishing themselves from those people who are not trying to create personal transformation, right? And so it struck me that this wasn't going to go very far, like in terms of movement building, certainly, and that the actual framing of the interview itself was in part the problem. I do think, contrary to many folks, that the interviewer plays a significant role in framing the narrative, okay, in terms of how the interview is structured. So I was perceived as the audience. The idea was I was going to take these interviews back and I was going to analyze and reflect on them, and they were not going to be shared with other people who lived alongside the people who were doing the interviews. And so when I indicated to them that I was interested in creating a zine where these interviews would be shared with others, none of them would consent to allowing their names to be attached to the interviews. Okay. And so they did consent to the interviews being shared, but they didn't want their names attached. So I decided to move to a different model altogether, just completely drop this idea of what oral history was. And instead, I bought a TV. I don't know if you can see these slides at all. Can you?
Yeah, maybe.
I'm not sure if there's a dimmer on them.
Let us know. Was that too dark? Maybe you can't read anything.
Yeah, I'm not reading, but I can't see you though. Okay, so we might want to turn it down when I show the video. But so what I did was I brought down a TV. And this is a trick I learned as a squatter. And I first identified a plug outlet on Public Square. So I brought down my TV with a inexpensive VCR. And the first time I did this, I just brought a documentary, Dark Days. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about the folks living in the tunnels of New York. But the main reason I brought that wasn't just so people could watch TV, but because I wanted to demonstrate that this is the space where your interview is going to be shown, right? So people would know exactly who their audience was, and that their audience was going to be, and people would be able to connect their face to their words and their narrative, other folks who were also homeless, unhoused, living alongside them in the shelter and outside in the camps. And so I brought down the video camera, and I asked them also, instead of their life stories, I asked them, I'm going to show you a video here. I asked them to explain their analysis of the causes of homelessness, the history and causes of homelessness, right? So I wanted, instead of asking them, tell me about your childhood, tell me what are the causes of homelessness? How did homelessness come to be, right? And that's what they were asked when they is set up, and here's just one, and I'm showing you this one for a particular reason, because this interview was the most popular interview in all the workshops I did later. I'll talk briefly about why. In this case, the narrator actually incorporates Jose Jimenez, appropriates the character Jose Jimenez, who was a character utilized by Bill Dana in the 1960s. I'm just now I have to look for my my material here. Bill Dana essentially took this really stereotypical image of a Puerto Rican that was largely disparaging, and I think it's kind of interesting that he appropriates this image, and I think reinterprets it, as I'll talk about briefly. So here's the interview.
My name, Jose Jimenez. Truth is, my name is none of your fucking business.
So why don't you tell me what's on your mind right now?
What's on my mind is the truth. I see on J Avenue and up on Huff Avenue, they're forcing out the poor and the lower middle class with $1, $2, and $300,000 fucking homes. You know what else they're doing? They're privatizing prisons who take contracts from people like Sony, Toyota, well, Nissan, same difference, Mercedes, Republic fucking Steel, and then they put all these poor people in these privatized prisons because they can't afford to live anywhere. Because they're building all these $1, $2, and $300,000 homes in my city. And all my people are going to jail because they don't make $50,000 fucking dollars a year. They all have to work for the temporary services, to buy cigarettes, to buy their beer. You don't have to worry about beer. All you got to worry about is paying your house note and paying your Lexus note. You come pay my bills, man. You come pay my bills. The truth is that nobody that is poor or lower middle class is going to be living in the city. They're all going to be living in the privatized prisons because they're all vagrants. They ain't got $100 in their pocket. You see? You come build these cities, and all these homeless people and all these poor people are going to jail to make all you guys money. You come build these cities. Come build these towns with my fascination. These beautiful homes down on J Avenue and down on Huff Avenue. Beautiful, gorgeous mansions in the heart of the ghetto. Yeah, you make the poor people go nowhere, because they can't go to the suburbs and they can't stay in the city. It's called a field of schemes, not a field of dreams. Come live in my world one time. You grow this garden. You grow this garden with my brothers and sisters. And let's see if you can stand up one more fucking time, little girl.
All right.
All right. So this is just one, but I think it's an interesting example. This one of the reasons why I think it was so compelling is because he makes so little effort to kind of establish credibility through, he's not wearing a shirt. He's very confrontational. He's not going to talk about how, I don't drink that much. He's very deliberately saying, yeah, I drink, but so do you, and you come pay for my bills. There's a question of who he's talking to, this framing of who is the audience here and how he's kind of moving back and forth. One is he's talking to this kind of imagined yuppie audience, right? But he's very also deliberately performing for the unhoused audience that's kind of immediately watching him and that will watch him the next week on that TV I just showed you. And then he's also talking to me, right? So he, stands up, literally kind of just asserting this hyper masculinity and kind of feminizing and infantilizing this ambiguous other. So, kind of referencing these popular cultural forms, in the end, I say, all right. There's certainly a degree of kind of confusion, acknowledgement of what he said, but also what do I do with all of this, right? And so partly is just figuring out okay, how do I analyze this? But really, to me, the important aspects were, and I will talk about this and analyze it, but the important aspects were also to create spaces where other folks could sit back and reflect on these interviews. Okay, just remember that interview for a second, and I'm going to come back and refer to it. But you can, I suppose I might as well just highlight them right now so that you can remember better. But there are numerous instances where he's kind of making gestures and very bodily referencing the physical space around him, using, referring to Huff and J Avenue and the very kind of act of standing up. Is to some extent a movement that I think is significant, and I'll explain why later. There's bodily movements within the actual interview performance, a very performative interview, as you can see, which is largely why it's so popular. But that's in addition to kind of that scaling of the scaling of who he's talking to, the kind of use of that public space, and ultimately kind of a reinterpretation, this occupation and reinterpretation of the space, which is ultimately a hostile space that they're turning into and making their own. Okay, it's a space where they face police harassment and brutality. It's a space where they're referring to dispossessions in various neighborhoods that are nearby in the downtown business district. But it's also a space that they utilize for their own kind of survival and everyday lives, and that they're shaping into their space. Food is bringing these conversations as well together. So instead of me just sitting around and interpreting it, he knew it was going to be played. Oops, we got to go back to this. These slides are not really working quite well. Okay, this is an image of the workshop. So the basic idea was to show the workshops, show these interviews in workshop settings, several workshops that were organized at local drop-in centers where meals are served, where people can hang out during the day, where people get clothes, take showers, etc. Also in the shelters. Frequently what I've found is that the best relationships these were also viewed as hostile spaces by the narrators. These were not friendly spaces. In fact, as I'll get into, the biggest, most significant critique that emerges out of the workshops as a major theme is the degradation, everyday degradation people are facing within the shelter, within their home life. Okay, and so utilizing these spaces really also is about kind of redefining those spaces and taking over to some extent those spaces that required a lot of networking with staff. Frequently at the lowest levels of the hierarchy are sometimes the ones that are the best ones to organize and work with in order to and something I learned from trying to solicit food donations is you don't ask the manager of a grocery store for produce. You ask the person who works in the produce section who's in charge of throwing that stuff out, right, to set it aside. And this is the same thing in order to get access to these facilities. But gradually we developed those relationships as well with people who were working in these spaces who allowed us to use these spaces for the workshops. And the themes that were developed included 6 of them, not in any particular order here. The first being the transformation of the downtowns. Okay, so lots of these interviews talk about the rise of the new stadiums, sports stadiums and convention center that entailed the demolition of the Skid Row hotels, the former flop house districts, and how this was a significant loss in autonomous living situation, relatively autonomous living situation that has now been superseded by highly controlled shelter system. Number 2 had to be was this reinterpretation of neighborhood renaissance. You heard that in that interview. One of the reasons, again, why that interview was so popular is because it cuts across many of these different themes. And really talking about the dispossession and the transformation of the neighborhoods that folks grew up in within those neighborhoods and give us a very different perspective. And ultimately, their perspective really kind of bears itself out as Cleveland becomes the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis in 1997. It's really at the Cleveland and Detroit have close, nearly half of the top 10 zip codes with the highest rates of foreclosure, leading into the financial collapse. So, this story is not just a local one. And meanwhile, the business leaders in the late 90s were talking about, the narrative was one of Renaissance and how Cleveland's a comeback city and how everything's being fixed up and cleaned up after the riots, which turns out not to be the one that really kind of effectively explains the reality. The expansion of the criminal justice system, right? So he ties in the role of the prisons here, but the prisons are defined as very, very closely intertwined with the homeless shelters. Really, homeless shelters are seen as an extension of the prison complex, referred to as open penitentiaries, jails, prisons, repeatedly throughout the narratives. Collapse of welfare, which is really defined as creating a greater dependency on low-wage jobs. And the rise of day labor agencies, which is linked to the meltdown of wages. So people are still doing jobs, and they're the most common job they're doing is punch press operator, which in the 1950s was a job in Cleveland that only white machinists, male machinists did, and they literally fought to keep African Americans from doing that job, unionized machinists. By the 1990s and 2000s, for homeless African American men and women, that's their most common job. It's working as a punch press operator. And then lastly, the growth of the shelter industries, which is ultimately seen as a loss of autonomy. And this becomes the 2 themes that emerge as the ones that people are most interested, the generative themes that people are most interested in addressing are the degrading conditions within the shelters, which is also linked to maintaining their ability to stay out of the shelters. because there's kind of two sides to that same theme. And then the second one is the exploitation of their work in their working lives. Okay, so two themes that I would not have really focused on if I just came in as an activist trying to tell folks what they should deal with. But these are the themes that emerged out of this situation. So, in part, these workshops had taken place in these shelter spaces, and the project increasingly expanded. A lot of this, as relationships developed, involved my physically moving throughout more and more spaces, understanding, getting a greater sense of the geography of these folks' everyday lives. So finding out the spaces where people do congregate, hang out, and talk, right? One of those spaces is in the line in order to get into the shelter. Long lines in order to get into the shelter. The long lines waiting to get food once one is inside of the shelter, right? And so almost always food is like very actively present. It's the time when people have their food or just finished eating where these are the places where people are having the most significant reflective moments. So every single space where we have the workshops, where we're doing the actual initial interviews, where we're having discussions within shelters or around food. Okay, so the shelter becomes the first place of organizing. The project participants create a petition drive literally to remove the people who are operating the shelter, which was the Salvation Army, and before that another group called Project Heat, which were private non-profit institutions that were running the shelter for the city and county, paid for by the city and county. So it's kind of this process of privatization. They created significant changes within the shelter. They literally shut down Project Heat, which then led to the rise of a new mega shelter that was run by the Salvation Army. Then they ran the Salvation Army out of the shelter after lots of organizing. And then ultimately they demanded that they run the shelter, but that wasn't, they didn't get that demand met. But they ultimately had a new agency which at least alleviated some of the most degrading aspects of living there. So dealing with those very immediate living conditions, there was a group called the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless who argued those weren't the issues we should spend our time on, right? But for the folks who are living in the shelters, these were the most important issues that they should be spending their time on. So I thought that was interesting. And I should also say these are what I viewed as ends. Many of the different ends of this overall oral history project. The petition, became an end, a product of the oral history project, that was informed by the oral histories and the themes, and ultimately shaped these movements. Ultimately, one of the things that kept on emerging as people were talking more and more is that we need to expand and amplify our voice, is what the word was. And the homeless president, who's pictured here, said we need to establish an air war. And this is how he referred to it, former Vietnam veteran. And so we set up a radio show that aired on the local college station, and these radio shows, each one to some extent became a product of the oral history show. They each got tapes. They brought them back to the shelter and the drop-in centers to play these tapes to other folks. People were listening to these, and what was gradually happening was this move from what I think is an apt way of looking at this that anthropologist James Scott talks about, is moving from the hidden transcript to the public transcript. Being able to develop a sense of confidence that you could say these things, right? These words where you would risk being cast out of the shelter, losing your job, in increasingly public spaces, right? Where you could confront power more and more directly. Right, with this very critical analysis. And so the radio show became significant. Nearly all the participants in the radio show played a very active role in many of the social movements that developed. The other side that the radio show played a significant role was protecting the homeless encampments around town and discussing these camps and the rationale behind why people were living in the camps and why they sought to preserve what most folks saw as miserable living conditions, right? So this was one space that eventually there's a major movement that the homeless president organizes, and this protest becomes another end, figuring out again, as people are expressing this protest to prevent the demolition of what was known as Camelot by the people who lived in this building, became a end, because for me what it meant was valorizing and supporting what folks wanted to do with this project, where they wanted to move it. And if they wanted to, the project meant that they wanted to prevent the city from demolishing this building, then that would then become an end that I would take time and effort to support. So this is inside the building. And in this process, I don't know, oh, you can't even see this. So in this process, you can, in this picture, the same person who I'm interviewing is talking to the media, right? And so what we start seeing again is this amplification of voice, this movement from the hidden to the public transcript, where here, rather than me going to talk to the media as an organizing person, the folks who are doing the narrators are themselves speaking for themselves in front of the media, telling them what their analysis is of the causes and why they're fighting and what are their struggles, right? We see the other issue, one of the workshops, and I should say, I really have to stress, this is not kind of a uniform analysis that emerges among the homeless. It's really kind of a recognition of the multiplicity of voices. It's very multivocal. And the movement here of people in the camps is different than the movement of people living in the shelter, within the shelter. And there's tensions, right? But because one of the strengths of using the oral history process here, of the process of critical reflection, is that in the emergence of what I view as a complex critical analysis, is that people can start seeing, while I may be fighting here, that it's intertwined with your struggle over there, right? And while we might be fighting for slightly different things, that they're still interconnected, right? And so this then becomes a way of creating this more complex critical consciousness through these workshop spaces, allows for these multiple different movements kind of around different issues kind of propping up. And one, I should also say, one of the efforts to protect the folks who are living outside emerges literally from that space where the videos are done. 1 week in the interview shortly after the one that I did there, and right before Thanksgiving, a person talks about how the mayor has instituted sweeps on the streets to clear the homeless out for the Christmas shopping season. And so there then is a discussion of, well, what should we do? And people say, we should set up a camp on the mayor's lawn. We should maybe set up a camp in front of city council. And ultimately, they decide to set up an encampment right there on the very same spot where the video interview was being done, which to me is about, again, using kind of the very bodily movements and the reclaiming the space through the performance of the interview in terms of redefining that very physical space, where that becomes a space where the tent is located that people are staying in and protesting, that becomes a very critical moment undercutting the support for the mayor in the city. Eventually doesn't run for re-election, not to say, and there's still now, right now with the reemergence of the Occupy movement in Cleveland, they're still dealing with the ramifications of this movement, you know, to not allow homeless to sleep on the streets. So the temporary day labor agencies becomes the other major theme, and the group, one of the workshops literally forms into a group called, which eventually becomes the Day Laborers Organizing Committee, DLOC, and they organize to create city council hearings, arguing that were over 20 people testify in front of city council about their grievances, and they coordinate their testimony ahead of time, talking about who's going to talk about what and what are our major goals that we need to communicate and what are we trying to get out of this. And they do these testimonies on the day labor industry while representatives from the industry are sitting in the audience. Okay, so this is really this creating of the space where a movement from the hidden to the public, deliberately moving at that moment with the city council hearings, and then you also have movements to drive the labor agents out of the shelters, and so this becomes a new area of a new space where another kind of aspect of this multiplicity of ends. And then lastly, I just want to say, part of the strength here in creating these spaces, not to say that all these discussions hadn't been had, but many of them had been talked about long before I had arrived. But bringing folks together from across these different divides, from different camps, from different cliques within the shelter, different individuals that weren't necessarily connected to a larger social network within that shelter, to participate in this discussion and then literally create movement from this, folks. So it's bridging these divides through these spaces that were crafted by these workshops that were set up to analyze the oral history project. Eventually, these spaces expanded. This is a picture that was taken in Chicago. You can see those two same guys that I showed you from very early on, the one on the far left and the one right here, had participated in this project. Both had done radio show. And this is them in Chicago at a NDLON, National Day Labor Organizing Network conference that was primarily organized by Latino day laborers from across the country. And here, what this ended up doing is creating a space where, for the folks that were predominantly African American, white, and Puerto Rican in Cleveland, moving to work within these industrial sites as day laborers, frequently found themselves working alongside Latino day laborers from Lorain, Ohio. And there was a very hostile, tense relationship. So figuring out ways, again, to start expanding those and bridging those divides across different barriers also proved, I thought, to be a potentially enormously powerful way that oral history could build movements. Now, this was done by one graduate student with a total budget of $2,000 over a span of nearly a decade. Okay, this was all done by myself. One of the things that was the weakness of this is that there wasn't a network of other folks doing similar work like myself that I could tap into to start creating these bridging these divides. So, for example, if there had been not a network, in addition to Chicago, but folks doing similar work in Lorain with Latino day laborers within Lorain, then we could create more immediate connections, right? If we had folks working who were still housed in Cleveland with people who are facing potential foreclosure, or people who were housed and working within the day labor industry in Cleveland, in addition to folks that were housed but were dealing with the stigmatization of being ex-offenders in the community, that this would have created a significant greater potential for addressing these issues, because all of those themes that they laid out there were not inherently homeless themes, right? And so finding the ways to create and establish these relationships and to share that authority for interpretation and critical reflection and defining which ways to move forward would have been strengthened if it wasn't me doing this by myself in an isolated situation. So eventually I leave as my graduate, as I get my PhD, I move to Washington, D.C. And other than the Food Not Bombs continuing to this day, which has largely been about sharing food, not about developing these conversations, this activity is largely dissipated, or we could have, or what should have happened. How come we're not doing this anymore? Right? And so that was partly my fault as well. But I'm going to open this up for conversations and let you ask questions or make comments. And I think I probably spoke way too long.